waiting for her. No, for Shelly. I was waiting for Shelly to give me a signal. Thanks. Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Jacobs, and I'm honored to be the chairperson of Kansas City's 2023 Yom Hashoah Holocaust Memorial Service. I welcome you to our program commemorating 80 years since the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the 60th anniversary of the dedication of the memorial to the 6 million and 78 years since the end of World War II. At this time, I'd like to honor the survivors here with us today. If you're able, please stand or raise your hand to be recognized. Thank you. Thank you. Please be seated. In keeping with the solemnity of this occasion, we request that you silence all devices and hold your applause. Also note that following today's program, in the theater, friends and families of survivors and all of those who perished in the Holocaust, everybody is invited to gather at the memorial to the 6 million to recite an additional Kaddish prayer. If you're able, please stand for the presentation of the colors by the Mocan Post 605 of the Jewish War Veterans, and remain standing for the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner and Hatikva and the Pledge of Allegiance led by the representatives of Scout Troop 61.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Colored by מזרח קדימה, עין לציון צופיה. עוד לא אבדה תקוותנו, התקווה בת שנות 2000, להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון וירושלים. להיות עם חופשי בארצנו, ארץ ציון וירושלים.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag, to the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Two.
To begin our service, I'd like to call upon Rabbi Elizabeth Bonnie Cohen of the Hyman Brand Hebrew Academy.
Yesterday we read in Parshat Shmini about the death of Aaron's two sons. Immediately upon their death, Moses attempts to offer words of seeming consolation to his brother, reassuring him that God will be glorified by all who draw near to the divine. To me, his words feel formal and distanced. I imagine him saying them with some amount of awkwardness, as if he doesn't know how to relate to his brother emotionally. It feels like something one might say in a moment of grief when one doesn't know what else to say. In many ways, his fumbling for words of comfort and reassurance is so relatable. What can any of us truly say when standing face to face with tremendously heartbreaking loss? How the Torah seems to answer that question is not in the words offered by Moses, but rather in the response of his brother. Very plainly, the Torah tells us, Vayidom Aharon, Aaron is silent. Now remember, Aaron is not known for his silence. On the contrary, we first come to know Aaron as the mouthpiece for Moses. He speaks not only before the Israelites, passing on the message of God to them, but also on their behalf, speaking with strength to Pharaoh, the ultimate human authority. Aaron's ease with words makes his silence that much more palpable, jarring even. It stops us. It's meant to stop us. It invites us to take note of the absence, to dwell within that which cannot be uttered. We live in a noisy world, full of words and images that distract us constantly from honest encounter with the depth of our emotions. And Aaron teaches us the necessity for silence. On a day like today, that silence invites memory. Memory of the 6 million, memory of parents, siblings, grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, memory of the ripples of trauma throughout the generations, memory of wanting to forget, memory of visceral sorrow that the body will always remember. Now, for some in this room, this memory comes more easily. The memory is raw and visceral, personal and vivid. Perhaps it's recalling family stories told over and over since childhood, picturing family albums of tattered black and white photographs and small trinkets that accompany these narratives. Or perhaps it's reliving firsthand experiences with no need for photographs, as the images of the trauma endured are seared in the mind, just as numbers on an arm. For some, the memories invited by this silence are deeply intimate, even carried into every moment of every day. And for others of us, the silence invites memory that is harder to muster. Memories that, while part of the collective story of the Jewish people, aren't part of one's personal family narrative. They are memories of the magnitude of the loss, the incomprehensible vastness of slaughter. They are the snippets of interviews and snapshots of museum displays. Perhaps these memories are more spotty and incomplete, a little emotionally detached, or perhaps even caught up in questions of whether or not one is permitted to feel the grief associated with the loss of other people's loved ones. Silence makes room for all of it. To hold the grief and the numbness, the intimate and the collective, the sorrow and the resilience. However, we've come here to remember today, Aaron's silence calls us to sit with this memory, to dwell honestly within the fullness of it, and to invite us to feel deeply all that it evokes within us. As we do this, as we honor the sacred memories we each carry and the collective memory of our people, may those memories be a source of blessing, comfort, and strength for us now and always. I now call upon Steve Cole, President of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, one of the organizing agencies for this commemoration.
On behalf of the sponsoring agencies, the Jewish Community Center, the Jewish Community Relations Bureau, and the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, I welcome you to this year's Yom Hashoah commemoration. Today, we solemnly remember the 6 million Jews and others killed in the Holocaust during the Nazi era in Europe and honor the memory of the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. From the beginning of the persecution of Jews in Germany in the early 1930s, up to the Allied Armed Forces liberation of the concentration and death camps, Jewish resistance to Nazi genocidal efforts took many forms: spiritual, cultural, religious, and in some cases armed. The armed resistance known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising began on April 19, 1943, as German troops entered the ghetto to deport the remaining inhabitants. It was the first revolt of any urban population in occupied Europe. For a month, heroic fighters held out against their well-trained and heavily armed opponents. Despite their best efforts and brave efforts, on May 16, 1943, the uprising was defeated. Of the more than 56,000 Jews captured, nearly 7,000 were shot. The rest were deported to camps and to death camps and concentration camps. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising remains as an important symbol of resistance and one that we honor today. Remembering that, we gather resolutely and proudly at the Jewish Community Center, where every day we build a strong, vibrant, and inclusive community that enhances wellness, meaning, and joy based on Jewish values, heritage, and culture. And we gather under the auspices of the JCRB AJC, which serves every day as a Jewish community advocate combating anti-Semitism and pursuing justice. The Midwest Center for Holocaust Education is proud to partner with those organizations in our unending work to teach the history of the Holocaust, applying its lessons to counter indifference, intolerance, and genocide, of which today's ceremony is a part. Our mission together today is to perpetuate the memory of what occurred and those who suffered and perished. But it is not a one-day effort. At MCHE, conveying the memory of the general community is the task every day. Adages like those who do not remember the past are doomed to repeat it compel us. MCHE works to keep alive and current the memories of the individuals who experienced the Holocaust, even as ill-intentioned people attempt to distort what occurred and as the passage of time and contemporary history threaten to push the atrocities of the Nazi era into the fog of history. MCHE conveys the Holocaust stories of the individuals who were there, so as to instill into the general community memory the horrific events and losses that we must commemorate today, so that they cannot happen again to anyone. And we will do the same next year and each after that. As Eli Wiesel said at the dedication of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial, for the dead and the living we must bear witness. For not only are we responsible for the memories of the dead, we are responsible for what we do with those memories.
Thank you for your words, Rabbi Bonnie Cohen and Mr. Cole. At this point, I'd like to thank Shelley Klein and Jessica Rockhold of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, Sarah Markowitz of the Jewish Community Relations Board, Ethan Helfand and Keith Weidenkeller of the Jewish Community Center, and Rabbi Doug Alpert, representing the Kansas City Rabbinical Association, for working together to organize today's event. You know, it's interesting today that we're just a few days after telling the story of breaking free from enslavement in Egypt over 3,000 years ago. At that time, the next generation told the story, and the third generation, and every generation since, and probably one of the most observed Jewish holidays we have. Today, as a second generation survivor, I think it's my job to remember, to mourn, and to never let this happen again. So here's the story of the Hungarian experience. As I said, I'm a second generation and a third generation survivor, as my mother here in the audience and my grandparents were Shoah survivors. When did people start talking about the Holocaust? In the United States, it probably started around the docudrama Holocaust starring James Woods and Meryl Streep in 1978. I think that was certainly the time when I first became aware that my mother's childhood was different. It was not normal. We watched this show, this miniseries, intensely, and this opened the door for her childhood stories, and then later my grandparents' stories of their experience during the Holocaust. I don't think very many American survivors were talking about the Holocaust before this time. And then later on in the 1980s and the 1990s, we saw the opening of Holocaust museums and Holocaust memorials like this one. And we've seen it ever since. In Israel, it started somewhat earlier, and it was highlighted by a trial in the mid-1950s of a man named Riso or Israel Kastner, who was a man who's accused of being a Nazi collaborator, the worst possible accusation in post-independence Israel, which had been a place full of survivors of the European Holocaust looking for a new life and in a new land. Kastner, who's a Jewish lawyer and journalist from a town named Cluj near the Romanian border, had negotiated with Eichmann, quote, blood for goods, which turned out to be an exchange of 8,600,000 Swiss francs in return for 1,685 Jewish lives. Kastner later moved to Israel, became a second-tier politician in David Ben-Gurion's Mapai party. He later stood trial as being a collaborator because the above-mentioned transaction, eventually was acquitted and later murdered in Tel Aviv. There's a 2009 film where the possible killers of Kastner were introduced to his daughter and his granddaughter, Meirav Mikeli, who happens to be the leader of the Labor Party in Israel today. It doesn't clarify the details or the motives what happened, and it had been suggested that this killer had ties to both Lehi, the right-wing group, but perhaps also Shin Bet. What happened? We have no idea. Well, the politics of the Kastner train is still unfolding. Oddly, Yad Vashem has minimal mention of Kastner. What does this have to do with my mother and my grandparents? Well, they were saved by Kastner. Back to their story. Somehow, they were told to show up on a train. They'd never met Kastner, but they didn't know what to expect. They were probably chosen because of my grandfather's affiliation with the Zionists in Budapest. They were lucky to get on the train. Back to the crazy story of Hungary. The Nazis didn't invade or occupy. I guess what's the difference? Germans didn't meet any resistance, so I guess occupy is a better term. Until March of 1944, this was late in the war. The Nazis were losing battles on other fronts, notably Russia. They felt they needed to conquer or occupy Hungary because of its geographic significance, but they didn't have a lot of resources to occupy this country. So they ended up occupying this country with fewer than 500 troops. Why? Because the Arrow Cross, which was the name of the Hungarian Nazis, and others wanted and would do their bidding for them. The Hungarian Jews were horrified. They had few options. Information was limited and confusing. Germans conquered or had occupied most of the neighboring countries. Thinking of this experience, the writer Dara Horn had said one of the most unfortunate lessons of the Holocaust was that Hitler almost got away with it. Eichmann almost got away with it. And Kurt Becker, I'll tell you later about him, he did get away with it. Hungary has a long history of waxing and waning anti-Semitism, but the Jews did very well. There were episodic pogroms and various anti-Semitic laws, but the Jews succeeded educationally and economically over the years. In World War I, Hungary suffered tremendous defeat. They lost half their land and half their population was negotiated at the Treaty of Trianon. A poor economy followed, which led to various anti-Semitic legislation, as it happened in many other parts of Europe. Numerous clauses, which are quotas, pogroms, blood libel accusations, occurred throughout the 1920s and later. But the Jews did well. It was estimated 50% of all the physicians in the country were Jewish. They were overrepresented in businesses and other aspects of the economy. It was estimated before the war there were 825,000 Jews, and they were largely in Budapest, but they were in small towns throughout the country. There were typically four groups of Jews. They were Hasidic, which were often Satmar, Orthodox, Neolog, which today would be considered somewhere between conservative and reform, and there were secular Jews. They tended to coexist and collaborate despite the religious differences. So this is a photo of the Doheny Street Synagogue, which is in downtown Budapest, which was a very lovely, luxurious synagogue still being used today. My maternal grandfather inexplicably left a very successful lumber business in Romania. He came to a small town in Hungary named Bekish. He set up a bar, was involved in real estate, and was very successful. They lived in the house upstairs, and a family member practiced dentistry downstairs. And this is a picture of their bar probably 20 or 30 years ago, after it had been changed, I'm sure, several times. My paternal grandfather was a teacher in a small town named Erdobenya. There were perhaps 60 Jewish families in town. They were spread throughout, and although they were dispersed, they used the same butchers, synagogues, and other businesses. They all competed for the same choice spot in Mrs. Kakel's oven for their cholent. The favored families got the center. The less favored got the peripheral spots. They baked matzah together, and they generally acted as a Jewish community, but the town was so small that my grandfather had to leave the town for gymnasium, a term for secondary school, in a nearby town. He had never experienced anti-Semitism till he got to the new town, goes to a friend's house, and his friend's parent said, "You're such a nice boy. It's such a pity you're a dirty Jew." Well, my grandfather did well, and he graduated from medical school, and this is a photo from his medical school class. Their wedding, my grandparents' wedding was delayed, so my grandfather, the oldest child, could help support his siblings. Eventually got married and set up a very successful radiology practice in Budapest. Life was typical of many educated, successful Jews: a nice apartment, a nanny, trips to the countryside, especially to visit grandparents. My grandfather became very interested in Herzl and Zionism, which became the focus of his outside interests. They held services, seminars, and other gatherings. Despite the anti-Semitism, though, the Hungarian Jews thought they were safe. And here are some photos just years before. In March of 1944, the Nazis again occupied Hungary with fewer than 500 troops. They had learned from the Warsaw experience that they wanted to avoid any uprising and any resistance as much as possible. So they cut off the countryside from Budapest, and they deported most of those Jews to labor details or Auschwitz. Those in the capital city didn't have a good idea of what was going on. At one point, my mother had a nanny with a thick German accent with what was presumed to be an assumed name. She was clearly not Hungarian, and my mother recalls a time when she was huddled with her parents, my grandparents, in a room explaining what was going on, and soon thereafter she disappeared, presumably fled. This was perhaps a sign of things that were happening. Another day, my grandmother got news that her mother had been arrested in a small town, so she dressed up in her best clothes, went immediately to the town, to the authorities, with a bunch of cash rolled up. She understood the potential consequences of bribing authorities. In a very brash manner, her bribe was accepted and her mother was released. During this time, there was a tremendous amount of confusion. One day they closed the schools for children, and the next the authorities came to my grandfather and told him he had 20 minutes to collect his personal things, and they were taking over his radiology practice. Resources like food, clothing, and heating fuel became scarce. At some point, my mother and her grandparents were told by the Zionist group to report to the train station. They had no idea where they were going. It turns out the operation was coordinated by the leader of the Hungarian Aid and Rescue Committee, one of Hungary's leading Zionists, Riso Kastner. He had negotiated the blood for goods deal. Initially, the negotiations included trucks and money for fewer than 1,000 people, but the numbers of Jews allowed on the train increased, as did the price. Multiple delays ensued, and eventually they were loaded into cattle cars with a small bucket for waste. The cars were overpacked, so sitting was difficult, and after a prolonged time, they ended up in a station in Linz, Austria. The Nazi soldiers yelled up at the various anti-Semitic epithets and told them to go shower. They returned to the train not knowing where they were going to go. Spain, Switzerland, well, they ended up in Bergen-Belsen. For 6 months, they were prisoners in this concentration camp. They lived on 300 calories a day, largely of what was called turnip soup, which consisted of a dark liquid in a turnip and perhaps a small piece of bread. If the weather was nice, they lined up outside for a prolonged roll call, and if the weather was lousy, they ended up reporting outside for a prolonged roll call. The same happened in the afternoon. The Jewish prisoners got discouraged. At one point, my grandfather, the radiologist, the physician, found 2 colleagues, and they set up a clinic in the back of the men's barracks, although they didn't have really any sort of supplies. They discovered one of their early patients was none other than my mother, who had been stricken with boils. Needless to say, people were concerned that these boils would be contagious and lead to an epidemic. The doctors in the clinic went around and asked for various supplies, and they got some: a needle, a couple matches, some ointment, and a couple sulfa pills. Well, they sterilized the needle, drained the abscesses, and rubbed this antibiotic ointment on them, and miraculously, these boils resolved. My grandmother, who's an artist, led art classes with 6 or 8 girls in the women's area, and their supplies largely consisted of sticks and mud. This helped their psychological situation. After 6 months, they were taken to a train, which took them away from Bergen-Belsen. After several hours, the train stopped, and there was a transfer of 6 suitcases to a Nazi officer. After the transfer, the train took them to Switzerland, which is shown above. My grandparents and mother stayed in a Swiss hotel, which converted to temporary residence because there was no tourism. They did that. They then sent my mother to a boarding school while my grandparents scraped by on meager income. Later, they were sponsored by my grandfather's brother to come to the United States, where he had lived in the Washington, D.C. area. Their boat, oddly enough, landed in Gulfport, Mississippi. One of the first observations was segregated bathrooms and segregation. There was a bathroom for whites and a bathroom for coloreds. This was devastating. Eventually, they made their way up to Chevy Chase, Maryland, where eventually they became integrated, and they created a life. Interestingly, my grandparents' closest friends for the rest of their years were Hungarian Jews. As time went on, they discovered that most of the family was murdered in Auschwitz, including aunts, uncles, and grandparents. A maternal uncle died in a work brigade, probably on the Russian front. My grandfather had 2 brothers who survived, one in the DC area and the other in Israel. So what happened in Hungary? Well, Hitler delegated the final solution, the murder of the Jews, to Eichmann, who's shown on the left. On the right is Kurt Becker, who's an officer whose job it was to pillage, to extract as many of the Jewish assets as possible for Himmler, who was head of the SS. Many of those assets never made it to Himmler, ostensibly stayed in his possession. After being caught after the war, going between countries, Becker offered up 55,000 Swiss francs worth of that money that Rudolf Kastner gave to the Nazis, claiming not to know what happened to the rest of the money. Presumably, he saved that. And that was the price that was paid for 1,650 lives. As my grandfather said, even the Nazis had their price. Hitler almost got away with it, but died at the end of the war. Eichmann got away with it, or at least until 1960. And Becker got away with it, dying at the age of 86, one of the wealthiest people in Germany. So what's strange about this is the Hungarian Holocaust happened when the Nazis are losing all over Europe, yet they persisted in this genocidal anti-Semitism. In the first 4 months of the Nazi occupation, it was estimated 430,000 Jews were sent to Auschwitz. And Yad Vashem estimates a total of 565,000 Jews died. 240,000 survived, largely from Budapest. So here we are, 78 years after the end of the Holocaust. The Midwest Center for Holocaust Education, Yad Vashem, the Anti-Defamation League, and many other organizations have been created to educate and combat anti-Semitism, yet it's as rampant as ever. Are these organizations failures? Of course not. But we can't expect these organizations to combat and prevent anti-Semitism on their own. It's strange to stand here telling the story of my mother and my grandparents while she's in the audience. But we, the second and third generation, had the daunting task to tell their story so our children can tell their story and their children can tell the story, like the story of Passover. Thank you. It's time now my pleasure to call upon Dr. Henry Kanarak, son of Holocaust survivor Dr. Joseph Kanarak, of blessed memory, to introduce one of the most traditional and meaningful parts of the memorial service, the lighting of the 6 candles representing the 6 million Jewish victims. The candle lighters will be assisted by Steve Fleckier.
Thank you, Jonathan. Throughout the world, in similar ceremonies, candles are lit in remembrance of the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children murdered in the Holocaust. The memory of the Holocaust reaches across our community, touching each of us. Today, representatives of 6 special groups will light candles. Holocaust survivors, children of Holocaust survivors, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, youth program participants, Jewish war veterans, and the greater Kansas City community. Judy Jacobs will light the first candle on behalf of the survivors of the Holocaust. Tom Jacobs, son of Judy Jacobs, will light the second candle on behalf of the second generation. Ezra and Rachel Jacobs, grandchildren of Judy Jacobs, will light the third candle on behalf of the third generation. Harper Withrod of the New Reformed Temple will light the fourth candle, recognizing young people who are committed to community service and civic engagement. Ora Reynolds of Jewish Federation of Greater Kansas City will light the sixth candle on behalf of the entire community. And Sheldon Turetsky of the Jewish War Veterans will light the fifth candle, honoring those who have served or continue to serve in our nation's armed forces.
Lord my God, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of man, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the man.
Please stand as Hazan Tal Ben Yehuda of Congregation Beth Shalom sings Zagnit Kenmol, the anthem of the Jewish resistance movement.
Letzten Weg, durch Himmeln kleine verstellen neue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser Ausgewend geschah. Es wird appointen unser Trottresen do. Kommen wird noch unser Ausgewend geschah. Es wird appointen unser Trottresen do. Vom grünen Palmenland bis Weinsland ohne Schnee. Wir können on mit uns der Pinn, mit uns der Weg. Und wo gefallen sitzt, verspritzt von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird durch unser Glore, unser Mut. Und wo gefallen sitzt, verspritzt von uns der Blut. Sprotzen wird durch unser Glore, unser Mut. The song was written with our blood and not with lead. It's not a little tune that birds sing overhead. The song of people sang amid collapsing walls. With grenades in hand, they heeded to the call. The song of people sang amid collapsing walls. With grenades in hand, they heeded to the call. Du Sogne kein Motals, du gehtst am letzten Weg. Von Schlimmen Bleiere verstellen neue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser Hausgebet geschah. Es wird appointen unser Trottresen do. Kommen wird noch unser Hausgebet geschah. Es wird appointen unser Trottresen do.
Thank you. In 1958, local Holocaust survivors organized themselves into a group called the New Americans Club. These survivors established two lasting forms of Holocaust commemoration. Here today continue the first, their annual Holocaust memorial service. The monument was the second. Inscribed on the flames are the names of family members of those in our community. Without proper burials or graves to visit, this monument became a marker for those wishing to remember their loved ones murdered in the Holocaust. This year marks our 60th anniversary of the dedication of this memorial. Our program continues with the singing of El Malay Rachamim by Hazan Tal Ben Yehuda.
El Malay Rachamim, שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה, תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים. לנשמות כל אלה שהזכרנו היום, לנשמות כל אחינו בני ישראל שנטבחו בשואה, אנשים, נשים וטף, שנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנהרגו, שמסרו על נפשם על קידוש השם, בגן עדן תהי מנוחתם. אנא בעל הרחמים, הסירם בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בטרח חיים את נשמותיהם, אדוני הוא נחלתם. וינוחו בשלום על משכבותיהם, ונאמר אמן.
Rabbi Linda Steigman, Temple Adat Joseph, will now share closing remarks and recite Kaddish in memory of the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children who perished during the Holocaust, and in memory of survivors from our Kansas City community who have passed away.
I remember my first visit to Yad Vashem in 1993. The most powerful and painful experience for me was the Children's Memorial. For those of you who haven't been there, I will describe it for you. You enter a darkened space with mirrors and candles. Each candle reflected innumerable times in the mirrors, signifying not only the lives of the 1.5 million children who were murdered, but also the descendants that they would never have. And just when you've adjusted somewhat to that powerful sight, you become aware that a voice is speaking the names of some of the children who perished. And you realize that for every name that was read, there were thousands of names that were unknown. This memorial gives voice to them. We Jews are very good at remembering, both in Israel and in the Galut, the diaspora. The three so-called modern holidays are all about remembering: Yom Hashoah, Yom HaZikaron, Israel Memorial Day, and Yom HaAtzmaut. Yom Hashoah remembers those who perished in the Shoah. Yom HaZikaron remembers those who perished in the building of the modern Eretz Yisrael. And Yom HaAtzmaut remembers the establishment of our modern state of Israel. Today, we are gathered here to remember those who perished in the Shoah, and to perhaps more forcefully, given the rise of anti-Semitism, say never again. Some of us are remembering family members who perished and have names to recite. Some of us come to show support and to remember as a community the millions of Jews who have no one to remember them. Hannah Senesh, because of the words she wrote, is a Nazi victim who is remembered by many. She immigrated to Israel as a teen and lived on Sodot Yam Kibbutz at Caesarea. She was trained as a spy by the Palmach and parachuted into her home country of Hungary. At age 23, she was caught and murdered by the Nazis. These are some of the words she left to us. Yesh kochavim. There are stars whose light reaches the earth only after they themselves have disintegrated and are no more. And there are people whose scintillating memory lights the world after they have passed from it. These lights, which shine in the darkest night, are those which illumine the path for us. For all the stars that are named, and for the millions that are unnamed, we rise as a community to recite the Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah, v'yalma divrach hirutei v'amlich malchutei, v'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei d'chol beit Yisrael, v'agala uv'izman kari v'imru amen. Hishmei rabbah v'varach le'olam olmei amaya. Yiparach v'yishtabach v'yipa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei d'kudsha b'richu minko birchata v'shirata tushbachata v'nechemata da'amiran v'yalma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav, huya aseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. May the one who creates harmony on high bring peace to us and to all Israel. And together we say, Amen.
If you're able, please stand as the colors are retired.
Retire the colors.
This concludes our program. We invite survivors, families, and all to join us at the memorial for the 6 million for an additional Kaddish prayer. Thank you for remembering.